Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about engaging board members, which is something that as a former executive director, I know quite a bit about. And anybody who's involved in board members or has been an executive director understands as well. I've sent out those emails where I got no response. Sent out a second email and still got no response. Or maybe one person who says, great idea, but doesn't offer to help. And it took me a while to really understand what I needed to do and that there was no quick fix. I'm going to talk today about definitely some tips that will help and that are pretty easy to implement. But the reality is that to engage more members takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And you just got to be willing to put in that work or it's not going to happen. I really learned that I needed to get to know my board members and then be able to ask specific people for specific things, and I'd get a much better response. In the end, I had a board member who he came to meetings, he was engaged, but otherwise he didn't really respond. He didn't help out with things. Until we were looking for a new office space for the organization. He was a real estate professional. And then he really jumped in and did a ton of helping us look at office spaces, evaluate office spaces. So it really showed me how much it's important to find the things that are meaningful to that board member and to help them engage in what they want to do. So I've been working with nonprofits for over 20 years as a staff member, as an executive director, as an interim executive director. The last few years, I've been a coach and a consultant to organizations. So I do things like board trainings. I do coaching of executive directors. I'm also just going to be starting here in the fall, a second round of my Successful Transitions course, which helps the organization work through succession plans in depth, really think through what are they going to do in emergencies, what's the board succession plan, and what's their leadership development plan. So putting all of that into place. So I want to start out and talk about a great book and resource that I always recommend to boards and executive directors, and that's called Boards on Fire. It's by Susan Howlett. And she really focuses on a lot of different ways to get boards more engaged, especially in fundraising, which I'm not going to go into in depth here. But first, what I want to talk about is the three modes that she talks about that how board operates. So first of all, you've got your fiduciary responsibilities. So that's things like budgets, legal matters, contracts. Those are the basics. And those are the things that boards are legally required to do. They are legally and financially responsible for the organization. But to be honest, it's kind of dull and boring. So we really want to get beyond that and get boards into more exciting work because, board members are talented individuals. They're successful in their daily lives and they don't want to just come in, hear a report, and rubber stamp a budget. So the next level is to get board members involved in strategic work. So how can they focus on goals, outcomes, maybe new collaborations, really thinking about what the organization does and how it could do it better. Still remaining on a big picture, we don't want board members getting into minutia and micromanaging, but how can board set achievable big picture goals that the staff can then figure out how they reach? Finally, that third level and the most exciting work is when you get into generative thinking. So that is really thinking outside the box about systemic issues. So if you have an organization that focuses on homelessness, how can you think about what is it that causes people to be without a home in the first place? And how can we address those issues? Or how can we come together with our partners and work better on the issue of homelessness so that it's less and less an issue? If the board is engaged in thinking at that really high level, then they can come back down to the strategic level and start making goals for the organization that really fit that big picture systemic issue. once they're more knowledgeable about it. So you really want to get the board working more in that generative mode um, as much as possible. Now, reality is it's easy to get stuck in the fiduciary role and just focus on the finances and the legal issues because those are easy questions to discuss. They often have answers. They're more black and white, and they may relate more to what board members do in their day-to-day jobs um, as managers. So some of the things that board members tend to get wrapped up in that really should be left to staff, things like approving who's going to be the new vendor for carpet for the office, or what software are you going to use on the computers. Uh, Sometimes boards start to meddle in hiring of staff besides the executive director, or creating job descriptions, or even staff salaries. Those are the executive director's role. And so just really, sometimes it takes the executive director saying, nope, that is my purview. You can give me the overall picture of what you'd like me to do, but then I'm going to make those individual decisions. So it takes time to get the board out of that fiduciary management role and into more governance, but it can really benefit the organization in the long run. When the board is really being productive, then the executive director is using the board as a sounding board and bringing real problems to the board, big picture problems, to discuss them and get that variety of perspectives from people who are engaged in the work and excited about the work, but not so focused on it day to day. And really then taking that input from the board, and then the executive director and the staff can figure out, how do we implement it? How does this actually look on the ground? Board members may see needs in the community that need to be filled, that at least should be discussed and talked about to figure out where you can go from there. So it is a partnership and it's a delicate balance, but it's going to take the board and the executive director continually renegotiating what that looks like and understanding who's responsible for what. But if it's an open conversation and people are really talking about it, it will be a productive partnership. The other time that it can be easy to lapse back into fiduciary duties is when there's a crisis. If their executive director leaves suddenly, there's a serious issue with an employee, there's a global pandemic, the board sometimes does need to step in and focus on their legal and financial responsibilities. And so it's easy to get into that habit of focusing on that. And so really important to take the time to get people past their fear. Maybe there's trust issues. An executive director was embezzling funds and the board had to take over. It's going to take them a little bit of time to be able to let go and let the new executive director really exercise control. I was at a nonprofit where, as an interim, where the board chair signed off weekly on the executive director's timesheet. I'd never had a board chair pay any attention to my timesheets as an executive director. And I really pushed back on that. I really said, you've got to trust your executive director. And that one I didn't win. They were adamant that that was something they wanted to keep doing. And I don't know where that trust issue came from and why they had instituted it, but it was something that board really felt strongly about. So next, I really wanted to talk about some specific things around meetings and how you can make meetings better and really engage people as part of the meetings. So one of the first things that you can do is to make sure that every meeting starts with introductions. Yes, you know all the board members, but they often, they see each other once every month or two. So especially those first few months, they don't really know each other. And they haven't had a chance to really meet. So thinking about, doesn't have to be every time, hi, my name is Susie and I work at this company. What's something you could ask them to share that would be new and different? I always start by asking people to tell me why they're involved with the organization. because it's always fun to hear everybody's different reasons, um, and how they've come to the same place, but from very different directions. You can ask them to share a particular moment that it has inspired them as they've been on the board. Or here's another one: ask where it is they serve besides your board. Um, a board member generally is pretty civic-minded and is doing a lot of other volunteer work. Find out more about that. So get to know your board members as people and get everybody together to really create a team. Next, it's always a great idea to have every board meeting include some kind of mission moment or success sharing. What has happened in your organization over the last month since the last board meeting that's been really great? And if you can rotate which board member shares this, then they may have to do a little research and find out more before the board meeting. That could be a great way for them to get more engaged in the work. Consent agendas are, of course, always a great idea to really not spend time on routine matters or reports during the meeting. So things that can go on a consent agenda and just be approved all at once without discussion if there's no need. The last meeting minutes, the current agenda, sometimes the financial reports don't need discussion, any other reports. So the idea is to put on the consent agenda the things that happened in the past. They don't need to be discussed because they've already happened. Of course, anybody can pull something out and say, hey, I really want to talk about this more in depth. But if you with a consent agenda, you're making that separation clear that this is what's happened in the past. We don't need to talk about it. We're going to move on to the future. And that just frees up a lot of time. It makes your board meetings a lot more energizing. Another thing to include in a meeting is just some kind of training. And this can be short, 15 minutes. But how could the board members be better board members? What's maybe an in-depth aspect to your work that is something the board members might not know about? So maybe they read an article in advance of the meeting. One board I was working with was reading a leadership book, a chapter at a time, and discussing that for a little while. So really help the board members get more engaged in your work and in being on the board itself by giving them a little bit of training each time. Then from there, you can really go into strategic discussions. This can sometimes be what I talked about earlier, the generative, looking at the systemic issues and looking outside the organization. What are your partners across the community doing to address this issue? How could you work together better? It could also be looking at a scenario. We've obviously been through a lot of this recently with the pandemic. How can we all work from home? It's probably not a scenario we really had considered before, but now suddenly nonprofits are really doing that work. And maybe in the future, they don't need an office, they don't need such a big office. Some other great questions to have the board discuss. One is ask them to really have a good discussion of why people should give to their mission. Why instead of anything else? And having them have that discussion and think through the real reasons why they participate, why others give, will help them become better fundraisers. You really want to involve board members early on in challenging situations. You don't want to wait and the executive director brings an issue to the board with all the solutions already figured out, because the board then doesn't feel like they had any say in things, and why should they even bother? So really thinking about how can you involve this team of experts that you have in your corner early on in the process to talk through issues. Finally, if you are discussing something more in depth, great opportunities to assign randomly 1 or 2 people to be the devil's advocate for that topic for the day. And so have them really figure out what are the pros and cons of that, and how could you argue the opposite. It really gets people thinking in a new way about things, and might get some really creative ideas out there for you. So those were some different ways to address meetings. So we're talking about intros. Oh, and I forgot to mention that when you go back to having meetings in person, food is always really important for bringing people together. We talked about mission moments, consent agendas, having a short training, and then those strategic or generative conversations. Now I want to talk about outside the board meeting, what are ways to get individuals engaged? So one way is to certainly meet individually with each board member to learn about their strengths and interests. And I'm surprised when I talk to executive directors who say they've never done this, that they've never sat down one-on-one with the board member, maybe just a few of the board members. It really matters. It certainly takes time, but your board members are your biggest volunteers and donors. They're very important, and so they need to be treated as if they are important. And the more value you put on that relationship, the more value they're going to put on participating. You can then really find out what are they excited about doing in the organization. Are there things that they've wanted to do? Maybe they're curious about event planning and they've never had a chance to do that in their day job. Or maybe they really would like to get into the budget more and understand how nonprofit financials work. You can also find out from them. I remember sitting down with a board member who had just told me, oh, I don't really have any connections. I don't know anybody. And by the time we were done, we'd come up with just a whole bunch of different people. They weren't people with a ton of money, but she had a friend who runs a dry cleaning business. For our big event, we needed our tablecloths dry cleaned. Well, that was a great connection. So it's really taking that time. You discover all kinds of new partnerships that you never thought of. And then you can really help them connect the dots with how their contribution makes a difference. So I think we take board members for granted that they're just going to help out and they're going to be there. So how can you help them understand that them coming to a board meeting every week really makes a difference? People need to be reminded of that. It's easy to just kind of, I have to go to that board meeting. It doesn't really matter. But if they're reminded that, hey, you coming to this board meeting means that we can do X, Y, and Z, it's really going to make an impact on them and encourage them. Like I said at the beginning, it's those emails out to the entire board asking them, okay, we need to form a committee to do this. You're not going to get a response. People aren't going to be excited. Whereas instead, you maybe send out an email initially so people are aware of it. And then you start calling people and saying, hey, we need to form a committee for our annual event. And I think you would be really great on it because of this. Would you serve? You're going to get a much better response. And if you've already met with them individually and you've gotten to know them, you're going to also get a better response. Finally, with individual board members, it's always good to just ask them for advice and really think about that. It's always said with fundraising, if you want money, ask for advice. And if you want advice, ask for money. Same with board members. You want them to be engaged, ask them for advice. They are a diverse group of people with very different backgrounds and different perspectives, and they may see the work differently. So it's important to just get their advice on things and see how they're thinking about. Finally, I wanted to talk about the structure of the board. So we've talked about different things we can do with meetings, different ways to engage individuals. There are some things to do with board structure that are really important to bring the whole board together and really make them much stronger. So that would include really making sure there's good communications between the meetings. So I instituted when I was an executive director on Fridays, I would send out an email with just a quick update of what had happened that week, just to keep the board members abreast of the week's happenings. I tried to keep it short, just highlight a few things, but just to make them feel more engaged with the work between board meetings. I also had a board member one time tell me that board members should never be surprised. You don't want them to find out from someone else about something the organization is doing or a change you've made. So those weekly emails just let me make sure that they knew what was going on and weren't surprised. Always important as you're bringing on new board members to give them clear expectations of what board service is. We just tend to say to prospective board members, oh, don't worry, it'll just be an hour a month for the board meeting. That's all you have to do. And we're doing everybody a disservice by saying that. So really making it clear what board members are expected to do, how much they do outside of board meetings, committee structure. And it takes holding them accountable to those things, but that's really important. I talked more about this in a previous webinar I did on board recruitment, putting together job descriptions, orientations, all of that's really important. Then in the board, self-assessment is another important way for board members to stay engaged. So that's really making sure that each board member is connected to the work and really thinking critically about how both they are contributing to the work and how the board as a whole. So it's really important, at least annually, to just take that time to really use an assessment tool and think about, okay, what am I doing? How could the board as a whole be better? And you'll get a lot of really good ideas from that. And finally, sometimes we wind up with way too many committees. I know of one organization that just gave up on committees altogether. They were getting to be too many. So they don't have any anymore, but that may be going a little too extreme. But sometimes it really does help to form a committee to tackle a problem. So, succession planning is a good example. I work with boards a lot on succession planning, and it's a complex topic. And for some people, they don't want to do it. They do not want to work on that. That's not their area of expertise. They're not interested. So that's a great example of something where 3 or 4 board members and the executive director can get together and really just focus for a few months on succession planning. But then they're done. It doesn't have to be a long-term project. Reviewing succession plans happens every year, but the executive committee can take charge of that once the plan's in place. So think about that as, okay, we're going to create an ad hoc committee just to tackle this one issue in depth, and then we'll move on. So those are some different ways to really get your board more engaged. It's not easy. It really takes a lot of time. And that's the thing that I think everybody wants the shortcut. How do I just snap my fingers and the board members are going to be engaged? And that's not going to happen. It really takes sitting down with each board member, getting to know them, making changes to board meetings, board structure. But I can tell you that over time, implementing these things really does make a difference, and you start seeing things happen. One of the most exciting things that happened for me when I was an executive director, as I was slowly making some of these changes, was we had a big annual fundraiser. It was a ton of work, as the annual fundraiser dinners always are. And the board finally decided that they were going to be responsible for that event. So the board committee was led by a board member. They recruited sponsors and silent auction items, and they worked with the chefs. Of course, staff still had plenty of work to do, and we weren't off the hook completely, but it did make a huge difference. And it was really the board collectively as a whole saying, we're going to take ownership of this event, that made the difference, because then that got passed on to the next group of board members. And so they came into the board knowing that a committee was going to be in charge of this event. And that just continued because the board felt responsible and they knew the staff couldn't take on all of this. So I'd be happy to talk to you more about your board and how you can get them engaged. Really hope that some of these tips have been helpful to you. I've got more ideas. I've got trainings I can do with the board to help them learn about their roles and responsibilities. So just send me a message and Be happy to chat more about any issues around board work. Thank you.